simplifying it, and then getting that interest rate down across the board, which probably saved me tens of thousands of dollars in the long run.
Welcome to the Freedom Point Real Estate Podcast, where we talk about creating more time freedom through passive real estate investing. Passive investing in real estate challenges conventional investment wisdom. We are passionate about learning and sharing resources with others who are ready to transform their investing mindset. Quick disclaimer as always, I am not a CPA, I am not an attorney or a financial advisor. This is not financial advice, not telling you or anyone else what to do. The views and opinions expressed in these podcasts are provided for education and informational purposes only and are not necessarily the views of my employer, ADP. I'm glad you're here. Now let's dig in. All right, welcome back, Freedom Point Podcast listeners. Thanks again for jumping into another episode of the Freedom Point. I've got an excellent guest with me today, Mr. Tim Little. Tim is the founder and CEO of ZANA. Am I saying that right? ZANA or ZANA Investments?
ZANA, you got it right the first time.
ZANA Investments. And ZANA Investments is a Tampa-based real estate investment firm named after his two daughters, Zara and Lana.
Zara and Lana.
Zara and Lana, thank you. Tim is passionate about helping fellow military veterans escape the landlord trap and get competitive returns. So interesting topic here to talk about, Tim. Thank you for joining the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So if you wouldn't mind, why don't you tell our listening audience a little bit more about yourself and what you're currently focused on?
Sure. So my background is largely military, right? Joined straight out of high school. Just didn't have the money or resources to go to college. Probably wouldn't have been a good idea even if I did. So, got a couple years of discipline, got to travel the world, got out, and then was ready to go to school, did that whole thing. And somewhere along the line, an ROTC recruiter got to me in college and convinced me that I should go back in, this time as an officer. And so I did that and, did about a good 5 years, 5.5 years in the Army as an officer. And this was during, the surge and everything else. So a couple of deployments here and there. Around 2008, I was ready to take a knee. So got out and decided I was going to go back to school. So went to grad school. And, 2008 was an interesting time, especially to be studying economics as I was studying global trade. That's what my master's was in.
In 2008.
Yeah, exactly. A master course.
Yeah.
Of course, the professors, all they could do is teach what they had. They're like, I don't know what to tell you about what's going on right now because this is unprecedented. So coming out of that, I was going to graduate in 2010, right? And I was like, this market is still not looking great. So I decided to stay in one more year and get my MBA as well, because they had a dual degree program with the between the business school and the international studies school. So I was able to get an international MBA to make myself more marketable. And you could argue that was a good choice, bad choice, because I came out with an obscene amount of college debt. But at the same time, I was able to get a decent job, right off the bat. And somewhere along that line, I got interested in real estate. It originally happened, 2005, read Rich Dad, Poor Dad for the first time, like so many people. Started to really understand and resonate with the whole assets over liabilities, but just didn't have the time. It just wasn't the right place in my life to start doing that. And then, as a college student, I was too broke, etc. And so it wasn't until I got into that solid job where I was making a little bit more money that I was like, okay, now I'm going to do this, like for real. And so I committed to investing in real estate, not being a real estate investor. It wasn't like a job I was seeking. This was something that I wanted to do just to diversify and have another stream of cash flow, right? So I bought my first duplex in 2014 in Richmond, Virginia for about $85,000 because that's what I could afford. I certainly couldn't afford to buy anything where I was living, which was Washington, D.C. And I wanted it to be a multifamily unit. That was really important to me, pretty much to mitigate the risk of only having, one renter. Um, and it just made more sense to me from a, economies of scale and all that stuff. So I committed to buying a multifamily unit, bought that duplex in 2014, and that's really how I got my investment journey started. And we can go from there.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And thank you for filling in some additional background there. So, one thing that we talked about off the air was when you exited college, you had $130,000 in college debt and you paid it off in 5 years. So, how'd you do that?
So, I mean, as anyone who has that amount of school loan debt hanging over you, it could be quite a burden, both mentally and financially. So, what I did is I made a plan. I said, okay. And the first complication was that I had several different loans. This isn't, straightforward like, hey, here's this one loan that you pay every month. It's like six different loans. And so you're paying different interest rates to different places. And so the first thing that I set out to do was to consolidate those loans. Now, there's not many people at that time, anyways, who were willing to do loan consolidation, especially for school loans specifically. But because I had an MBA, luckily that put me in a category, just with like, law school, doctor school, etc., that they were willing to take that risk. It seemed like a safe bet. So I was able to consolidate my loans, and some of them were as high as 8%, for 40, $30,000 loans. I was able to consolidate those loans, making it much simpler to pay, and then also refinance the rate to, it was a little over 5%. So that was a huge first step, right? Simplifying it and then getting that interest rate down across the board, which probably saved me tens of thousands of dollars in the long run. And then after that, it was really a matter of being aggressive in how quickly I paid it down. I never paid the minimum. And the way I did that is I just lived below my means. And that's something that I was raised with. So I was used to it. You treat yourself every once in a while, you just don't go crazy with it. And so I was, instead of paying, 800 a month, which was, I think was the minimum, I was paying 1200 a month, right? I was paying at that time the equivalent of some people's mortgage towards my school loans so that I could pay it down faster. I didn't know how fast I'd be able to pay it down, but the point was I wasn't going to pay the minimum because I didn't want to be 60 when I was still paying these things off, right? Eventually, when say circa 2016, when we were leaving Washington D.C. to move here to Tampa, where I'm at now, we were able to sell our property and make about 85,000 in profit.
This was that condo or duplex that you purchased in 2014, correct?
No, this was actually my personal residence.
Okay.
And so what we did, again, the whole living below our means thing, right? Back then, you couldn't find anything in like the, Virginia area that surrounds DC for less than 350,000 and up. But that just seemed like so much money to me and my girlfriend at the time. We were like, no, we can't do that. Like that's ridiculous. So we kept telling our realtor, like, no, cheaper, no, cheaper. And she's like, okay, now we're going into some pretty sketch neighborhoods because you want cheaper. And we're like, that's fine. Let's just check it out. We're young. I had a 90-pound Doberman. I felt pretty confident about it. So we found a house in Southeast DC in an area where a lot of people were not willing to live, and we paid 250,000 for it. And then turn around 4 years later, it was worth about 100,000 more. And so we were able to use that 85,000 in profit, and we looked at each other and we said, "Hey, this is probably the best decision. Let's just go ahead and pay off the school loans." And by that point, I had been, pretty aggressive, like I said, in paying them down. I had gotten them down to about $83,000. So I literally wrote a check for the balance, which was 83,000 and change, and zeroed it out right there.
So you got bit by the real estate bug, and the real estate bug helped you to accelerate the pay down of your student loans. I think that's remarkable. $130,000 in student loan debt is certainly a big number, but normally the story isn't that the individual pays it off within 5 years. I know there's plenty of people probably still in their 30s that are still paying off their student loans, from a decade earlier. So thank you for sharing that. I want to pivot to something else, and that is what made you decide then, once you started to get into active real estate ownership, what made you decide to go straight into multifamily versus maybe the single family fix and flip, or single family home rentals?
Yeah, so it's two things, and I touched on one, which was the mitigating risk, right? So it just real simple. If you have a single family house, you are either 100% occupied or 100% vacant. There is no in between. But if you have a 2 unit, if you have a 4 unit, say you have that 4 unit and you have 3 units occupied and one vacant. Well, now you probably have more than the cost of that mortgage coming in to cover it, even though you have that vacancy. And so that's why I wanted to start where I could, which was, at that time a duplex. And I later traded it up to a triplex using a 1031 exchange. And we can talk about that. But I was intent upon one, mitigating that risk. And then the other piece was, reading some of these books and going to some of the conventions. I learned about, your freedom number, right? Like, okay, if I'm assuming $200 cash flow per door, how many doors do I need to buy in order to replace my W-2 income? And this rarely happens, but that's besides the point. And so I figured out my number was like, you know, it was like I had to buy like 50 duplexes or something. And I was like, that's not realistic. Like, one, because of the limitations set on lending and capital and everything else. And so I was like, well, this isn't going to work. So that when I did the number with single family, obviously it was twice that. And so that's where this progression started. I was like, well, I obviously can't start at single family. Let me start at small multifamily and then figure out how I can grow from there. Because I think it was, like 100 or 50 single family units, but I needed 25 duplexes. That's still a lot of damn duplexes. And that's where I was like, okay, this isn't going to work either. And then I got introduced to syndication, which kind of gave me a different solution to the problem, I guess.
Yeah, so let's talk about syndication. So we're going to fast forward now to today. What are you up to today as far as the syndication space goes in the multifamily? What are you working on today? What are you looking for tomorrow? That kind of thing.
Yeah, and so right now we're pretty active in what I call the Sun Belt region. Georgia, Florida, Texas. I personally really like Atlanta, and we own a couple of properties there. I think it has great fundamentals. And so what we do is, a lot of times we partner with other general partners. Say if they found the deal, they call us up. They recognize the skills that we're bringing to the table, and we partner up to take these larger deals down. And when I say larger, I'm talking, like 100 units and up, because that's pretty expensive. Right. Those are usually not the kind of things that you could joint venture on. We have done that as well with something more locally, a 24 unit property. But generally, we're co-GPing on these properties, which simply means that we're partnering up with other general partners in order to take it down. And so we have right now properties in Dallas, Tallahassee, and the Atlanta MSA.
Okay. And are you looking for limited partner investors to partner alongside of you in these investment opportunities?
Yeah, and then that's exactly what we do, right? So each of us, we may have responsibilities as it relates to asset management or investor communications and stuff like that. But there's the expectation that all of us are raising money. And so that's why I focus on the military veteran community, right? That's the one that I know best and can relate to the most. And for me, it's really important that I educate them on this opportunity, because just like I didn't know about syndication, most people don't know about syndication, and it's certainly not something that they're learning about while they're in the military, or even when they get their retirement training as they leave the military. So I want them to know that there are other opportunities outside the stock market that don't have that same volatility, that have great tax benefits, etc. And so that's why I really like exposing this opportunity to other veterans.
That's great. So obviously, your investor avatar, is really a military veteran, right? How do you, outside of the fact that I'm sure you're relatively well networked in that space, how do you go about finding other military veterans that might be interested in diversifying, outside of Wall Street and into real estate from a passive sense?
Yeah, and so a lot of it is social media, whether it's LinkedIn, Facebook, increasingly. And what I found is, one, I'm surprised at how many other multifamily operators are prior military, but there's a lot more of those than I expected. But also, there's a lot of people who are just curious about multifamily in general. And they, may ask me questions, and maybe I worked with them at a previous assignment, and they start seeing my posts, and they'll say, "Hey, I saw you doing this real estate thing. What's that all about? How can I get involved?" And maybe they're at a point where they can invest, and maybe they're not. But that's okay. That's where I'm educating them all along the way. And then 1 year, 5 years down the road, when they do have that money to invest, I'll be able to help them do that.
Yeah, I should have said this 15 minutes earlier, but I do want to publicly state thank you for your service to our country.
Oh, thank you.
My next question is, what questions should a passive investor, we'll call it, a military veteran, what types of questions should they be asking somebody like yourself before they decide to invest or partner alongside with you in a future real estate syndication?
So I think the questions that they should be asking are, what kind of communications can they expect, from that sponsor, right? How often am I going to hear from you? Is it going to be, once a week, once a month, once a quarter? Because I think communication is very important, and I advocate for over communicating. Right? They could always ignore my emails, and that's fine. But I don't want them to ever say that they were wondering what was going on, or they haven't heard from me. Because when people don't hear anything, that's when they get nervous, especially when it comes to investments. So I think the cadence of communication is an important thing. Their track record, right? And maybe they're new. Maybe they haven't done a ton of deals. If that's the case, then okay, who are they partnering with? Do the skills and experience of whoever they're partnering with kind of, I hate to say make up for, but balance out their lack of experience? I think those are two big ones. And then I think it's important to listen to what questions they're asking you, right? If they're not at all concerned with what your investing goals are, if they don't say, "Hey, are you more focused on cash flow, or are you just more concerned about the overall returns?" Kind of set it and forget it for 5 years. If they're not asking some types of questions to that effect, then that to me would be a red flag, because it tells me that they don't care as much about alignment. They'll chuck anything at you, not being concerned with or even knowing what your investment goals are.
Yeah. Now I know that you don't have a crystal ball, and nor do I. Is now a good time for people to be investing in multifamily?
So I would say that, and people say the same thing about the stock market, right? If the stock market's down, oh, should we stop investing in the stock market? I think the point is, there are always deals, and there are always ways to make money. And so as long as you trust the sponsor, and you've, vetted the deal to the best of your ability, then there are still some great deals out there. They're becoming harder to find, for sure. So you may not see as many passing into your email, right? Whereas before, maybe you were getting pitched 20 deals a week. Now it's two. But there's a lot of sponsors doing a lot of work into the underwriting to make sure that these deals are good. So while you may not be seeing as many, what you're seeing are probably the ones that are left over that actually make sense. And sure, I think the returns may not be the same as they were, say, like a year ago, when we were going through the anomaly that was COVID and post COVID. But that's where kind of the expectation management needs to come in and say, hey, I know on this last deal, we made you 3x on your money in 4 years. Well, that's not going to be the case now. And I hate using the word new normal, but things have moderated, right? They have settled back to a normal rate. But I think the other piece of it is how does it compare? How does it compare to potential returns in the stock market, in your high yield, I'm using air quotes, savings account, and other options that you have to invest that money? Because if it's just sitting in a regular savings account or checking account, then it's slowly being eroded, by inflation anyways. So these are all considerations that you need to look at. Sure, you could do nothing with it, but just know that your money is losing its value during that entire period that you're doing nothing with it.
Yeah, absolutely. The opportunity cost of not doing something is and can be significant. What are maybe a couple of different ways that an operator or maybe even a passive investor, what are some strategies they could use to really kind of de-risk a deal, right? There's a lot of different ways that, sponsors evaluate whether or not a deal makes sense, with a paper and a pencil and an Excel spreadsheet. But what are some ways that the passive investor that's never invested into a deal before, what are some ways that they can kind of, ensure that this is truly a conservative, investment option for them? What are a couple of things that maybe they should focus on?
This is where, like, if they get their pitch deck or they see their webinar, whatever the case may be, it's important that that sponsor is highlighting the stress testing that they've done on that deal. And that can look a couple of different ways, right? And so I think some of the best ones I've seen are where they provide an investment, say it's $100,000, and they say, hey, these are your returns if, right? And it shows different scenarios to show, even if things go bad, bad being a relative term, like, then your money is still good and you've still had a decent return. May not be as good as in the optimal scenario. And just some examples of that are, say, like cap rate. And I don't want to get too wonky because I hate talking about cap rates, but if the sponsor is assuming, a same or lower cap rate, that is not conservative because they're assuming that their property will be more expensive later, right? And again, I don't want to get into the specifics, but just to say, the cap rate on exit when they decide to sell should be assumed to be higher than when they bought it, because they're making the assumption that the market got worse, not better. And if your investment still makes a decent amount of money, even if the market got worse, then it's probably a pretty good deal. And the other thing I would, I guess, caution is to look at their assumptions specifically for rent raises, right? Are they kind of going out of the park on with their assumptions for rent raises just based off the last year, which may have been very, very high? Or did they go more conservative and say, hey, you know what? We're not even assuming any rental increases for the next year or two, but after that, it's 2%, 3%. That's very conservative. Now, hopefully, it goes gangbusters and, it's 7% within 1 year, 8%. Who knows? But you want to look out for those things and make sure that they're not being overly optimistic with their assumptions. And they should be clear on what their assumptions overall are.
Are you primarily focused on seeking opportunities and investing into opportunities that are your traditional, value add, B class asset, B class neighborhood, 100% classic interiors, you're looking to get in and get out within 3 to 5 years? Or are you more of a longer term investor where you're looking to hold that asset for 5 plus?
I'd say we're starting to shift. For the past couple of years, that was our core focus, and it worked well for us. But I think the market as a whole is shifting, so we're not necessarily opposed to it. We are trying to get away from the C class, just because it's so management intensive and there's so many more issues associated with it. Um, so if it's value add, we're looking more at the B class properties, but then now we're starting to look at A class properties and partnering with good GPs who, find deals like that, because we're recognizing that there's value in that stability, right? The returns may not be as great when you're just optimizing for, say, efficiency in management, right? Because you're not redoing every unit, you're not adding a ton of amenities, you're really tweaking something that's already stabilized. And so you can certainly increase the value, but it's not going to be to the same extent necessarily that you could with a traditional value add. And that's okay. You'll have more stable, but still hopefully decent returns on that asset. Because when it comes right down to it, capital preservation is the first priority for for at least from my perspective for our investors. We don't want to lose your money. Everything after that is the secondary priority, making you as much as we can through, reducing costs, increasing revenue, etc.
Tim, I have 4 children, two of which are teenagers. Um, Oftentimes, their friends like to listen to our podcast. What if you could go back and give your 16 to 18-year-old self one financial piece of advice? What would that advice be?
Yeah, and I try not to harbor any regrets, right? But I think the one that I wish I would have done, like I said, I was in the military 18, straight out of high school, and the first year I was in Korea, so call that a wash, right? Everything was paid for. I had a place to live. But the second year I was in Texas, and then I knew I was getting out, and the smart me would have looked for where I was going to be living, which would have been Tallahassee, because I had already gotten accepted to Florida State even before I got out of the Army. And I would have found a house in Tallahassee, bought it using 0% down with my VA loan, and then rented out the 2 other bedrooms in a 3 bedroom house and had someone pay me to live while I was going to college. Not only would that have reduced my costs, and I wouldn't have had to work my butt off as much as I did in undergrad. I was working at Chili's and Cracker Barrel, etc. But I also would have started building my net worth from a relatively early age, much earlier than I actually did, and I think it would have set me up financially infinitely better than I have. I have no complaints about finding out late, but still, had I the opportunity to go back and do it over, that's probably something that I would have done.
So you'd have been a little bit maybe more focused, had a little bit more clarity, took it a little bit more seriously, those types of things. So you have two daughters. So how have Tim Little's priorities changed as you've gotten older?
Yeah, and I think just as well as I do, your priorities shift enormously once you have children, right? Everything goes to them in terms of why you're doing things, and maybe even your risk profile, what you're willing to do. And so for me, part of why I do this is to set an example for them. I didn't have like a strong, I guess, example of entrepreneurship growing up. And so I want them to see that, just so that they know what the possibilities are. And I want them to understand what I'm doing too. I had a triplex that was right here in the Tampa area. I would take them with me if I was fixing something on the inside, not because they were much of a help, because they weren't, but, just so that they understand what I'm doing, and I'm able to explain it to them. Hey, we own this place. The other people, they rent it from us and they pay us money so that we can pay the mortgage, and then we get to keep the rest, and in terms that they can understand. And those lessons will compound over time, and I think it'll give them a great advantage.
This may be a bit of a softball question, but if you had $100,000 in cash sitting on the sidelines or maybe locked up in an old IRA, where would you invest that?
So I actually did, and I listened to one of your previous podcasts where you had a self-directed IRA expert on, and I've done that as well, right? I had a TSP, I think it was my military one, that I rolled over into a self-directed. Well, it was a solo 401k, but that's basically a self-directed IRA, and I've invested in real estate with it as a passive investor. I've done loans with it as well. So people really don't understand the level of flexibility that comes with that. That being said, the $1 million, I, while I would be tempted to, I probably wouldn't put it all into real estate because I know at a certain point I need to diversify. So yes, some of that would be into more stable, very long term investments like an S&P 500 fund, something to that effect. But I think I would start to diversify more in terms of the commercial real estate that I'm investing in because so much of it has been multifamily. I've diversified by like class, A class, B class, etc. But what I haven't gotten into yet is like self storage. Car washes are becoming really big right now, and I'm just starting to understand the fundamentals behind that. I mean, when you don't have really any employees and people just swipe a card and drive through, those are pretty good fundamentals. I mean, so I'm starting to learn about these other assets, and I think I would start to diversify into some of those, mostly because I don't want to have my money locked up or invested for 20, 30 years. So if I could do these investments that are 5 or 7 and still get really nice returns and really nice tax benefits, that's going to be huge over the long run, and then I could continue to reinvest.
Yep. Rinse and repeat and compound, the seventh wonder of the world. It is amazing how many different things are syndicated today that I don't think were syndicated, in the past. My first exposure to the word syndication was the Green Bay Packers being a syndicated football team, right? And then it kind of launched into the multifamily space. And, it's hard to believe that you can syndicate, things like self-storage, facilities or properties, and you can syndicate car washes. I even heard the other day somebody's looking to syndicate a poultry farm, like a chicken farm, right? So there's all kinds of different things out there that it seems like can be, syndicated and invested into today. Tim, my next question for you is: what is, outside of the fact that you're serving the veteran community, what is one other way that you use your talents to give back?
Really just making myself available, right? We talked about earlier, like there's a lot of people, including a lot of my, friends, family, network that are in no position to throw down 25, 50, let alone $100,000 to invest. But they may be there, like I said, in 5 and maybe it's even 10 years. So the more knowledge they gain now, the better prepared they'll be to do that. So I make myself very available, whether it's on the social media platforms. If you go into my website and scroll down, my phone number is right there. That phone number, that contact number is my phone number. So anyone can literally call me and text me to ask questions. And it's not like I'm a lawyer, right? I'm not going to charge you for the time. I'm busy like anyone else is, but I'm more than happy to answer anyone's questions, whether they're an investor or not.
What is the next item on Tim's bucket list?
Ooh, that's a tough one. So I love to travel, and I think we're right now we're planning a trip to Germany, um, and I've been there like 4 times, so it's not a huge deal for me, but it'll be the first time that we're bringing my kids, right? And so that's a big deal. We took them on a Disney cruise. That you could argue that's international when you step off into resorts, but this will be their first international experience, right? Going around, exploring, going to a German bakery, seeing the mountains, that kind of stuff. So I guess on behalf of them, that would be my next bucket list item, the first family trip overseas.
How can our listening audience connect with you to learn more about what you're up to?
Absolutely. So anyone, again, can get a hold of me by email, tim@zanainvestments.com. freedompoint.com. I'm very active on LinkedIn, and I'm starting to get more so on Facebook. So you can find me on all the social media platforms. I also have a passive investor cheat sheet that's available if people want to check that out. And what that really is it has definitions explained in plain English with some examples of the top terms that I think you need to know to be confident when you start passive investing, because we sure do use a lot of jargon in this industry. So people can go to zanainvestments.com/cheat sheet to get that, or I'm sure you'll have it in the show notes.
Yeah, we'll absolutely add those in the show notes. I appreciate that. And Tim, really appreciate you jumping in and joining me on an episode today of the Freedom Point podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. And sorry, I'll add one more thing. If people like podcasts, which I'm guessing they do if they're listening to this, they can also check out The Journey to Multifamily Millions, which is my podcast where I hope to have you as a guest very soon, Jeremy.
That's great. And can you repeat the name of the podcast one more time?
Sure. Journey to Multifamily Millions.
All right, audience, go check that podcast out. I have listened to a few of Tim's episodes myself. He does great work. He has great guests on. Again, Freedom Point podcast listeners, we really appreciate you joining us today and look forward to having you on the next episode.
Thank you for hanging out with us today and for listening to the Freedom Point podcast, powered by Starting Point Capital. This show is for entertainment purposes only. Nothing said on this show should be considered financial advice. Before making any financial decision, please consult with a professional. This show is copyrighted by the Freedom Point podcast. Written permissions must be granted before syndication or rebroadcasting. If you're interested in connecting, you can find contact information at startingpointcapital.com.